early introduction to some of my future research. So this is actually going to be part of my second book project if I ever finish the first one. And the second book project is tentatively titled The Yellow Commons. And what that book project tries to do is it tries to think through Asian America, not as a social construction, but as an ecosystem. And the kind of impetus for this project is thinking about ecological crises and devastation, particularly within the geologic epoch that we find ourselves in now called the Anthropocene, okay, where humans have become a sort of geological agent that is changing the composition of the earth and is affecting our earth systems in ways that we see through like climate change, through species extinctions, through the rising seas and so on. And the question animating that project is what Asian American studies might have to say about life in a more than human world. And so the paper that I'm going to present today is actually a paper that I wrote last May, and it took me about a month to write. I was really rushed because there was a call for a special issue of the Journal of Asian American Studies on COVID-19. So I rushed to write this paper. I sent it in. After a few months, I heard back and it was not accepted for publication. And this paper basically languished on a shelf for the past, half a year or whatever. And so I'm excited to return to it today. I'm really excited for our conversation that will follow. I apologize if this is just kind of like the dregs of my own work, but can't do anything about that now. And I will foreground that the paper, I really haven't touched too much ever since last May. I've updated it a little bit in light of recent events. And I've made some cosmetic changes in order to turn this more into a presentation rather than strictly a paper. So with that, let's get into the talk, which is entitled The Yellow Commons, COVID-19, Minor Feelings, Vital Futures. This talk is a mad rush to catch up to and leap ahead of a deadly event underway. It strives to make something out of a snappy, drawn-out crisis, that dense time-space wherein focus is sapped, the will is stunted, and body-minds everywhere are depleted, buckling over, falling apart. It aspires to imagine otherwise with the sensorium of a shattered ordinary. This effort is liable to error. If it proves to be valuable, it's not within the pragmatics of a collapsed world, but within futures that may yet come to be. Now, this talk addresses the COVID-19 pandemic by reading the affective registers of anti-Asian racism. I aim to address anti-Asian racism without using humanist responses, that is, by claiming that Asian Americans are humans just like everyone else, and hence we are deserving of political recognition, rights, and justice. Although racism and humanism may seem to be opposed, I will show how they are intimately related, that the human itself is a racial construct, and hence will not serve the purposes for which it is called upon unless it's radically reimagined. In this talk, I will develop an alternative that I call the Yellow Commons. Now, the commons typically refers to resources held in common rather than ones that are privately owned. You can think about water, you can think about air. More generally, the commons has come to designate collective modes of being that are not defined by private property or individualism. My chief inspiration in theorizing the Yellow Commons is Jose Esteban Munoz, who refigures the commons into a vibrant nest of, quote, brown people, places, feelings, sounds, animals, minerals, flora, and other objects, end quote. The pulse of this brown commons, as he calls it, is a shared sense of suffering, striving, and flourishing. Now, the slide from a brown to a yellow commons might appear to splinter differently racialized peoples and restore an East Asian hegemony within Asian American studies and politics. However, yellowness in this paper does not refer to an ethnic attribute or a marker of certain histories, narratives, or cultures. My use of yellowness is inspired by Fred Moten, who attends to Blackness in what he calls a para-ontological distinction from Black people. For Moten, Blackness is sociality. It is best discerned in political refusal, yet it is not a response. It's actually anti-Blackness that is reactionary, a kind of defensive reaction against forms of Blackness that would spell its demise. In other words, Blackness is, in Moten's words, anti and anti-normative, meaning Blackness moves against normativity, but also Blackness precedes it. It's antecedent to the normativity that would erase it. But what exactly is Blackness for Moten? Well, that's really hard to say, because Blackness does not have a single origin, nor a single end. Every iteration of Blackness evokes an incalculable set of relations and adds something new. Hence, Blackness is ever changing, ever incomplete. Blackness shimmers alongside being and nothingness, persisting as a field of shape-shifting potentiality. It knows nothing of property or the proper. It is, in Moten and Stefano Harney's words, an undercommons. So yellowness, in a para-ontological distinction from Asian people, incorporates all sorts of beings, whether they are Asian or not, whether they are human or not. Playing a starring role in the Yellow Commons is Yellow Peril, an enduring myth of Asian invasion and takeover that has animated immigration restrictions, surveillance, incarceration, and violence. But Yellow Peril does not only affect Asians. It recruits white and non-white bodies into xenophobic nationalisms. Non-humans are swept up as well. As Karen Cardozo and Banu Subramaniam have shown, Orientalist fears have been grafted onto so-called invasive species in the United States, such as the Asian longhorn beetle, the kudzu, the snakehead, and the carp, and we might add more recently the Asian giant beetle or hornet. Now, yellowness then is a manifold of protean relations in the wake of anti-Asian racism and its manifestations as imperial expansion, colonial settlement, and capitalist extraction, hence the Yellow Commons. But yellowness is not a reaction or a response to yellow peril. Yellowness is anti and anti-normative, a vital force that disorganizes in advance the worlds built by yellow peril. Yellow peril builds a world of exclusion, forced assimilation, regulation, exploitation, abuse, humiliation, gaslighting, assault, disfigurement, and murder. All of this works directly upon bodies, shaping not only what is, but also what could be. Yellow peril animates painstaking efforts to extinguish futures that lie on tangent from a white supremacist national destiny, but it never succeeds. As a panicky reaction, yellow peril tacitly confirms an elusive, powerful something, the yellowness that it cannot help but bring into being. So yellowness is anoriginary friction, otherworldly creativity, or the stubborn persistence of bodies waywardly assembled, to borrow a formulation from Saidiya Hartman. These relations find refuge in the Yellow Commons. Find them, nurture them, and futures thought to be buried will ascend on the horizon. In this talk, I will move along the underside of anti-Asian racism. I search for traces of yellowness that open alternative forms of the human, community, life, and survival. I want to affirm what anti-Asian racism gestures to, yellowness as a world-shattering, world-forming force. I am in pursuit of the Yellow Commons because we deserve futures without whiteness. Major crimes, minor feelings. The COVID-19 pandemic has undermined the good life. The US economy has tanked, unemployment has spiked, and the federal government continues to provide meager reprieve. As of yesterday, there have been 27.7 million cases of COVID in the US and over 485,000 deaths. Vaccine rollouts are slow and no longer carry the promise of swiftly returning life to normal. Asian Americans, as we know, are widely scapegoated for destroying the good life and have become targets of
my
violence.
daughter freaks out
We
about
know of a Brooklyn
everything
woman who
with
suffered second-degree
blood.
burns from an acid attack, a man and his 2-year-old and 6-year-old sons who were stabbed. We know the recent story of Vichar Watanapakdi, an 84-year-old Thai man who died after being knocked down on the streets of San Francisco. We know of Noel Quintana, a 61-year-old Filipino man who was slashed across the face on a New York subway. We know that businesses have been vandalized, people have been mugged, teens have been bullied, and pets have been assaulted. From mid-March to late October of last year, Stop AAPI Hate had received over 2,800 reports of harassment, assault, and discrimination. And we know that's only a small portion of the actual incidents that have occurred. The assault on Asians stems from the pandemic's disruption of whiteness in its cruel and usual mode. Sarah Ahmed has argued that white bodies typically enjoy a powerful sense of comfort in a world oriented around whiteness. For them, quote, "It is hard to distinguish where one's body ends and the world begins," end quote. But what happens when the world is suddenly full of invisible enemies? We know the coronavirus can be airborne for hours and that breathing has become life-threatening. Asian bodies have been made to be sensed as death in motion, as foreign substances crawling under the skin of bodies and under the skin of the world. Ejecting and eradicating those substances are meant to restore the harmony of whiteness. For whiteness, violence is therapy. Now, the pandemic underscores that anti-Asian racism is an ontological issue. So it's not about who is superior and who is inferior, as if there were a common frame of reference for different peoples. Anti-Asian racism is about who can and who cannot exist given an image of the world defined by whiteness. As artistic director Chil Kong says in an interview with the New York Times, it's just, "How dare you exist in my world? You are a reminder of this disease, and you don't belong in my world." Asian American feelings of non-existence are ever present, and feelings of non-existence is a phrase from Frantz Fanon. These feelings are usually more like background noise, but in the pandemic, they have become especially pronounced. Feelings of non-existence are minor feelings, Kathy Park Hong's term for the racialized range of emotions that are negative, dysphoric, and therefore untelegenic, built from the sediments of everyday racial experience and the irritant of having one's perception of reality constantly questioned or dismissed. But minor feelings, it's important to note, are not small. They are so vivid that little else can feel real. Yet whites misinterpret, diminish, and discard the experiences of Asian Americans because their sense of reality is offended. Minor feelings are intensely charged, but actified. Whiteness leaves no place for them in a white world. But I find minor feelings to be strangely confirming. A feeling of non-existence is still a feeling after all. It is powerful evidence that one persists when the world says they don't. Its intensity is a measure of immeasurable potentiality that is under erasure by whiteness. Minor feelings, then, are impossibilities crashing into the real relentlessly. When the terms of existence are defined by whiteness, to not exist counts for something. Affirmation of non-existence may be a rejection of assimilation and an orientation to worlds undefined by racism. The Yellow Commons avails itself in minor feelings and behind racist and xenophobic fear. So the following sections of this talk will attune to the Yellow Commons by confronting anti-Asian racism and humanist responses to it. The biopolitics of yellow life. In late March of 2020, someone told me about a conversation they had regarding potential food shortages in big name grocery stores. When they mentioned that a particular Asian mart appeared to be well stocked, a white man interjected with a warning. Things there don't look like they've been dead long enough. Anti-Asian racism continues to be fueled by white norms of proper eating practices. Asian food cultures are held to violate supposedly sacred boundaries between humans and animals, and to open a floodgate of microbes and viruses. As we all know, American news pundits and politicians have asserted that the quote unquote China virus or Wuhan virus originated in bat soup. And these associations are depicted in a cover of a compilation of already published writings on the pandemic by critical theorists like Giorgio Agamben and Judith Butler. The cover of this book features a black and white illustration of 11 bats with menacing eyes and bared teeth that are meant to figure the combinations of the Asiatic and the pestilent. But I want to return to this bizarre statement, okay, because it highlights forms of life that threaten the human. In the West, raw meats are considered unsanitary, a potential cause of illness and even death. The transition from live animal to dead meat is not complete. So the human consumer becomes too much like the animal they consumed. We see the functioning of race, as in Rachel Lee's words, quote, a modality of recognizing and disavowing the contagious status of fungibility, end quote. Anti-Asian figurations of consumption embody anxieties over becoming uncivilized, animalized, ill, disabled, and dead. So whiteness then is resistance to a slide from human to animal, from wellness to illness, from capacity to disability, from freedom to constraint, from life to death. These are falls from higher to lower tiers of what Mel Chen calls animacy hierarchies, or grades of entities by liveliness, sentience, agency, or animatedness. But this statement raises important questions about the biopolitics of animacy. Is consumption of what is clearly dead supposed to confirm that one is in fact alive? And if so, what notions of life and death are being presumed as true, and how do they crowd out and erase other understandings of what life and death are? Do anxieties around the agents of illness, such as undead meat or improper foods, indirectly confirm a kind of unruly vitality? And could that life be vivifying to Asian America? Biopolitics distinguishes life and death based on a particular notion of life. As Rachel Lee observes, quote, biopolitics operates through a logic that carves up life into localized and bounded sectors and lets die the non-modern, non-optimal biologies. Lee's account of biopower is innovative because she gestures to a life that is anterior to the biopolitical cut. Before it can regulate populations, before it can consign people to life or death, biopower initiates a transubstantiation. Life is then jammed into bodies that are individuated, localizable, and bounded. Lee gestures to a notion of life like Gilles Deleuze's, which is not a property of organic beings, but a shifty, immanent force. It is collective and it is non-corporeal. Such life may be the pulse of the yellow commons. Fears of contagion, illness, and supposedly improper consumption react against a life that threatens the racist and colonialist enclosures of the human. But such a life may actually be a vector of Asian racialization. Political theorist Quinn Lester, hi Quinn, gives the name bio-Orientalism to racist figurations of the Asiatic as unwieldy, massified life by using tropes of the microscopic, the animal, and the inhuman. Bio-Orientalism depicts what Jack London calls yellow life as, quote, and these are Lester's words, spreading beyond and spilling over what should be the proper boundaries of a life form, end quote. This eerie echo of Deleuze raises concern over whether the life of the yellow commons is a safeguard against yellow peril. Is yellow life, or what I have called yellowness, a portal to survival or to death? Yellow peril reduces yellowness to a set of attributes that it seeks to negate, such as being machine-like, emotionless, uncivilized, or being too efficient, too productive, and too superhuman. To affirm yellowness, one must reach behind anti-Asian racism for what it seeks to foreclose: a life that spans humans and non-humans, and that is collective rather than individualized. Yellowness cannot be untangled from yellow peril, but that doesn't mean that it is compromised. What matters is how the fine, mobile lines of the yellow commons are navigated and tweaked. Will yellowness be affirmed or negated? Model immunity. Now, during the pandemic, the framework of biopolitics has been used to explain the expansion of sovereign power, emergency measures, and heightened security protocols. These explanations and their authorial lineage, including Michel Foucault, Giorgio Agamben, and Achille Mbembe, maintain fairly distinct lines between life and death. What is overlooked are the complexities of anti-Asian racism. The somewhat incongruent logics of yellow peril and the model minority myth evade simple placement of Asians in Foucault's categories of make, live, and let die. Anti-Asian racism is better accounted for in Roberto Esposito's account of biopolitics as immunity. Life is preserved not by eliminating all threats, but by incorporating innocuous versions of a substance to fortify itself against more destructive strains. This is the logic of vaccination here. The model minority myth immunizes the American body politic from critiques of its racist distributions of life and death. Asian Americans are typically heralded as proof that racialized peoples can become valuable life if we assimilate and work hard enough. The model minority myth works against Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and yes, against Asian peoples. Now, in times of intense anti-Asian sentiment, like we're seeing in the pandemic, yellow peril replaces the model minority myth and rearranges a biopolitical order. How is the body politic immunized when Asians turn from vaccine to virus? Violence against Asians becomes a social imperative. For non-Asian people of color, it might even be a bid for admission to the body politic, a bid to become human. And Asian Americans, in their bid to be humanized, have often reinforced immunitary biopower. One significant example is hashtag I am not a virus, which originated in France and spread throughout social media. What these posts under this hashtag are about usually is a portrait of a person with a caption that provides identity markers saying, I'm not a virus, I am a mother and a doctor, or I am a brother and I'm queer and I'm a student. And identity markers such as occupation and kinship positions are offered up as proof of humanity. Former Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Young reiterated this stance in an op-ed for the Washington Post. He urged Asian Americans to, quote, embrace and show our Americanness ways we never have before, end quote. And Young explicitly invoked the immunitary paradigm when he says, we are not the virus, but we can be part of the cure. Young tacitly confirmed that Asian American belonging is predicated on instrumental value and not some inherent human dignity. Whites remain default human citizen subjects, while non-whites are forced to endlessly prove and thus fail to prove our worth. We are only meant to immunize whiteness. If we don't, we can be discarded. Now, model minority responses to yellow peril aspire for humanity through immunity. They distance Asian American identity from viruses, germs, and non-human animals. But what exactly is the notion of humanity to which they aspire? It is one that has been overrepresented by man, according to Sylvia Wynter. Man was born in the Renaissance with secularization in Europe and in colonial voyages and missions of conquest in the Americas. It was further developed in the 18th century with the rise of the biological sciences, and it was nuanced in the mid-20th century under neoliberal capitalism. The origins of man in property are found in the ownership of slaves and the theft of native lands. Wynter highlights the Negro and the native as man's others and we might add to this list the Oriental. Lisa Lowe and Aiko Day have shown how man emerged by recruiting Asians as indentured laborers and coolies in service of colonial settlement, capitalist development, and imperialist expansion. And Anne Chang has observed that modern personhood draws upon a figuration of Asiatic femininity through ornamentation, which has persisted in Western art and literature since Plato. Now, the Oriental has long been associated with germs, viruses, and disease. As Nyan Shah documents, San Francisco's Chinatown in the 19th century was associated with rampant disease. We know that media coverage of SARS, avian flu, and COVID-19 has overly relied on images of mask-wearing Asians. And this association of Asians and masks recall Mimi T. Wen's remarks on the hoodie. Where racial optics operate through vitalizing or animating a thing such as the hoodie as contiguous with the body it covers, we find that race does not depend on immovable parts, but on a dynamic constellation of signs, screens, expectations, and forces. So the Oriental is an elastic figure, wavering between model citizen and biological menace, but it can never surface as man, who is figured as unraced, clean, and well. Immunitary responses to anti-Asian racism come at a steep cost, such as leaving open the question of who might be a virus and thus deserving of mistreatment, marginalizing those without quality healthcare, the ability to practice social distancing, or the privilege of working from home, abandoning the incarcerated, the detained, and the houseless, reinforcing illness and disability as markers of subhumanity, sidelining a collective refusal of individuated subjectivity and its racial terms, and relinquishing yellowness, the very power that threatens the worlds built by anti-Asian racism. The scramble to shore up immunitary defenses tramples over the task of reimagining life, the human, bodies, community, care, and survival. So what if Asian Americans and others rejected the call to immunize the US body politic? Might Asian Americans respond to racism and xenophobia without leaning on man? Viral community. Now, I had been conceptualizing the Yellow Commons prior to the COVID-19 outbreak. In conversation with new materialist, critical biopolitical, and ecofeminist cultivations of Asian American studies, I have been tending to Asian America as an assemblage of humans and non-humans across space and time. The Yellow Commons is a shape-shifting nest of more than human relations that transgresses biopolitical divisions. My stake in the Yellow Commons lies in developing forms of care that are not restricted to racial, species, or material boundaries. Julietta Singh might call these forms of care dehumanist solidarities, or social bonds that are mobilized and sustained through a refusal of the sovereign human subject, and that enact agential forms of inhuman relationality. But COVID-19 has raised really hard questions about how expansive the Yellow Commons may be. Does the Yellow Commons afford a place for harmful substances such as viruses? Can the Yellow Commons have internal divisions? How might protective measures be taken in the Yellow Commons without activating violent and lethal forms of biopower? And what exactly is the notion of community that is built in the Yellow Commons? Now, I must admit with much unease that viruses are indeed part of the Yellow Commons, but let me be clear. Viruses do not have equal moral or political standing as other beings, nor are they worthy of protection. But viruses are a powerful and unavoidable force and thus have become a part of community in a very, very specific sense. According to Esposito, the community isn't a mode of being, much less a making of the individual subject. It isn't the subject's expansion or multiplication, but its exposure to what interrupts the closing and turns it inside out, a dizziness, a syncope, a spasm, in the continuity of the subject. Community is not based on identity. It is a gathering of disparates that changes them. In community, no one remains the same, and no one remains a one. Viruses are members of the yellow commons insofar as they make a difference. And as we all know, COVID-19 has compelled new rituals of home, family, friendship, intimacy, work, care, living, and dying. So I propose virality as a condition of the yellow commons. Virality replaces immunity with community as the basis for imagining bodies. This is an alternative to the imagination of the body that we've inherited in modern biomedicine, which is, according to Ed Cohen, quote, a defensible interior which needs to protect itself ceaselessly from a hostile exterior, end quote. According to Cohen, biomedicine derives this notion of the body from the Roman legal concept of immunity and the notion of self-defense that was formulated during the English Civil War. So this is not science leading politics, but it's politics leading science. Virality, on the other hand, treats the body as an open system. Bodies emerge through complex interactions with multiple interfaces, whether they be natural, social, technological, or medicinal. Enclosure of a body is a contingent barricade rather than a sign of a body's natural state. Exposure is default. Virality does not make protective measures unimportant, but what it does do is it emphasizes the value and the place of collaboration in protection. Tending to a latent commons of humans and non-humans, anthropologist Anna Tsing insists that collaboration means working across difference, which leads to contamination. Without collaborations, we all die. In other words, contamination may be vitalizing. Virality changes protective measures from defensive enclosures to mindful collaborations. Virality turns the search for life, community, and belonging away from humanist dead ends. Rachel Lee writes, an alternative to modernist biopower may also lie in a retrieved cosmological orientation, in which the extracted part is returned not to a political community of liberal rights-bearing subjects, but instead to a planetary commons of entangled biological life. As revealed by COVID-19, the yellow commons refigures life through relational notions such as contagion, exposure, and vulnerability. If man is an immunized figure, then virality is a genre of the human that enables communal forms of care. Viral care, or hashtag #WeAreAvirus. In the yellow commons, care is not based on property, an ontology of discrete bodies, or divisions between the personal and the political. One portal into that kind of care is Sick Woman Theory, a powerful and moving essay by Korean-American writer, performer, and artist Johanna Hedva. According to Hedva, capitalism holds wellness to be the default state of bodies and reduces wellness to the ability to work. It thereby holds disability and chronic illness to be liabilities because they reduce productivity. To maximize profit, capitalism has to let the sick woman die. But who exactly is the sick woman? Well, Hedva writes, the sick woman is an identity and body that can belong to anyone denied the privileged existence or cruelly optimistic promise of such an existence of the white, straight, healthy, neurotypical, upper and middle class, cis, and able-bodied man. The sick woman rejects the capitalist ableist notion that illness is temporary and that care should only be intermittent. If the sick woman organized society, vulnerability would be affirmed, interdependency would be cherished, difference would be honored, and care would be constant. Now, one embodiment of that form of care is a humble, commonplace object in the pandemic, the cotton mask. In an essay on masks, Mel Chen has argued that, quote, the mask wearer has broken the civic pact necessary for communitas, end quote. Now, this is certainly true of community based on recognition of faces, as in the racialized optics of the US nation state. But can cotton mask wearing signal a different community? As we know, while cotton masks do inhibit the spread of particles from talking, coughing, and sneezing, they are not quite effective at protecting oneself from contracting airborne viruses. In their faultiness as self-centered immunitary devices, cotton masks might be worn more out of selfless regard. They open a community that is not based on you look like me, but on I care about you, whoever you are. As COVID-19 was beginning to spread in the US, people took to sewing and gifting cotton masks. This was before a lot of companies started producing their own, and this was amidst the widespread shortage of PPE. According to Esposito, the Romans understood communitas to be based on the circulation of gifts, with emphasis on giving rather than receiving. Immunitas, or immunity, was opting out of the obligation to give. And we see this in refusals to wear masks or to respect social distance. And we see this in the Trump administration's denial of adequate funds to state governments, small businesses, and the most vulnerable peoples. In the face of this malfeasance, the cotton mask circulates communal notions of bodies and care. Cotton masks are a gift to others, both other people and the selves that we could be only if we are in community. But how do cotton masks bear the yellow commons? Well, they disorganize the immunitary logics of biopower that are fueled by yellow peril, wherein valued bodies need to be defended through violent and lethal measures. Now, this is so whenever anyone wears a cotton mask, but the case of Asians and Asian Americans is distinctive. When we put on a mask, we take on a staggering array of stereotypes: being disease-ridden, emotionally inscrutable, perpetually foreign, ambiguously gendered, disabled, passive, voiceless, fungible. A simple strip of fabric puts us at heightened risk for harassment, violence, and death. But it also disaligns us from the animacy hierarchies of whiteness. We reclaim illness, we reclaim disability, we reclaim passivity, and we reclaim objecthood. We become, in Summer Kim Lee's words, quote, against relatability, but for relation, end quote. We enact socialities undefined by demands to be accommodating. We dwell in and with and as the refuse of man. We forge dehumanist solidarities. We open community, hashtag we are a virus. In the Yellow Commons, community is the episteme, meaning it has the status of truth. Communal forms of care are evident in recent projects such as the zine Asian American Feminist Antibodies, Care in the Time of Coronavirus, a care package by the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, and the pre-pandemic Open in Emergency, a special issue of the Asian American Literary Review on mental health, edited by Mimi Cook. Immunitary care, on the other hand, is individuated, privatized, privileged. It simply does not make sense in the Yellow Commons, but in the world built by whiteness, where man functions as a regime of truth, immunitary care passes for common sense. So here's a nonsensical question. What if the figure defining the human were not man, but the sick woman? The final section of the talk, all future. The Yellow Commons is all in on other worlds. Now, this might seem to be wishful thinking or gross negligence of struggles to survive in the present, but the Yellow Commons actually centers upon the here and now, not as a confirmation, but as an intervention. Above all, the Yellow Commons is about survival. It doesn't let us forget that life comes from elsewhere, not from man, not from whiteness, and not from the worlds built by anti-Asian racism. But what does survival look like when COVID-19 has surrounded us with deathliness? I don't think it is simply about holding out for tomorrow. The present would be merely a waiting room for futures in which we could be whole and happy. Liberal governance would like us to believe in this notion of survival, for that makes inclusion and assimilation into our highest hopes. But many of us know better. Too much death is around us, and too much is any number when racism is involved. We look around and wonder who might be next. Holding close the ones we have lost, including those we do not know, we refuse that our loved ones are valuable only for their future potential. We are not merely lesser forms of who we could be. Survival as merely staying alive makes the future a dangerous fiction. It conserves the deathly structures of the present. Efforts to stay alive may be compromised if they do not address biopolitical figurations of life. Biopower boils down life to mere survival, and survival to mere life. This reduction separates the what and the how of life, making a distinction between life and living. Certain forms of life are then deemed to be excessive. Disallowance of those forms of life is not always direct killing, but it is always extermination. Biopower forces racialized peoples to endure the fallout of separating mere life from more life. But the Yellow Commons offers a different notion of survival. Political theorist Bonnie Honig reminds us that survival carries promisingly plural meanings, connoting not just the mere life to which emergency seeks to reduce us, but also the more life of emergence. Survival is generating more life together. Now, in the Yellow Commons, survival is activation of futurity already here, the more life that is mere life. It is immediate belonging to the world, not to the world of man, but to ones that persist in spite of him. It is lingering in the disjunctures between being and nothing. That experience is painful, yet confirming, for minor feelings are the affective tone of survival. The Yellow Commons is indeed unsettling, for it draws us into changes that change us. We might be tempted to turn back to the US nation state, to the cruel optimism of whiteness, to wait and to wait and to wait, to finally be recognized as human. We might dupe ourselves into thinking that the chokehold of man is actually a loving embrace. But if we instead heed the call of the Yellow Commons, especially if we are marked as perpetual foreigners, we may find ourselves coming home for the very first time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shomura. I'd like to open up the space for questions. Feel free to add it to the chat or feel free to unmic yourself and ask some questions. I know it was really rich with a lot of theory and great content, and so feel free to get clarification, and thank you for the applause. So I know, thank you for the talk, Chad. Every time I hear you, I'm blown away, and I feel like I have all these theorists that I need to look up and delve deeper into. But from what I gather is that the Yellow Commons is what we're striving for. That's, but you know, in this time, in like recently, there's been a lot of articles in social media that have really addressed the uptick in racial attacks, especially with elders, our Asian elders, especially during this time of the Lunar New Year celebration. They've been out in public and they've been under attack. And again, I feel like it stems from this notion that we are the virus, Asian Americans are the virus. And I know that we're striving to debunk that, but what are some pragmatic or what are ways that we can protect ourselves, and what are ways that people can intervene to, you know, combat it or dismantle it?
Yeah, thank you, Soya. And I think that you put into words really well what I'm trying to articulate with the Yellow Commons, which is that it's a form of striving, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think striving suggests at least two things. One, it suggests that what is present and what is before us is in some ways unsatisfactory, right? That it's not providing us with safety, it's not providing us with protection, it's not providing us with life. And the yellow commons is a kind of orientation, a striving to something else. And part of what I want to insist upon, and this is the second part of the yellow commons, is that what we're striving for is in some ways already here, but we don't always recognize it, not only because of the ways in which our perceptions of the world are shaped through this figure of man, but also because the yellow commons is by design elusive. It's ever emergent, it's incomplete, and it's defined by its potentiality rather than its specific forms. And so with that said, it becomes really difficult for me to answer the really sort of like pragmatic questions that you posed. And I think that they're important, right? Like, how do we protect ourselves and how do we intervene, or where do we intervene? I think I'll say at least a few things in this regard. That first, the ways in which we evaluate our practices, whether or not they're feasible, whether or not they're valuable, we need different metrics. So I'm highly suspicious of those metrics that are determined by whiteness, those metrics that are determined by private property, and those metrics that are defined by man. And I think that part of what we need to open up and have space for are practical actions that seem very impractical in a lot of ways. We have to work against common sense because of the ways in which common sense has been politicized. So that's the first thing that I'll say. But I think regarding specifically when you talk about protection and when you talk about intervention, right? So I think our forms of protection have to be more collaborative. And, this is something that we've seen all around us in the pandemic, where networks of mutual aid have popped up and been fortified, and people who may not have been drawn to those resources have become, indebted to them, and also even participants. So I think that's one thing that we have to look for, right? What are the activities around us that people are already doing? And I gave some examples in the slides of of zines, of this really awesome care package by the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. There's a lot of great practices in there. I see Yumi Sakugawa is here. She has a couple of really great exercises that I encourage you folks to try out. And regarding in terms of intervention, right, where do we intervene? I think where I'm primarily called to is intervening in thought. I think that's what theory does. Theory, rather than explaining the world to us, operates as a kind of intervention, right, to raise new problems and to ask old problems in new ways. And that's my own contribution. But I don't think that's only the job of the theorist. I think people are doing this all the time.
Thank you, Chad. And I know we have a lot of esteemed scholars here, faculty and staff from across, so feel free to share your resources. Feel free to, mic yourself and ask questions directly if you wish.
As I mentioned in the talk, it is not about Asian people, right? It includes everyone, and it includes everything, ostensibly. And I think what matters then is figuring out how you are summoned and called upon with respect to yellow peril, right? And I think that there's a lot of important work being done, but to sort of fortify and build community between folks who are Asian and folks who are Black. And I think that work is important to take up. And the kind of only thing that I'll add there, and maybe I'll throw out there, is, with this specific language of allyship, I think that it is fruitful. And I think that there are certainly valuable parts for that drive. I'm not always sure that allyship is what we're looking for, but we're sort of led to it, And I'm thinking about this in relation to a talk that Nick Estes gave at CU Denver, I guess about a year and a half ago now, almost a year and a half ago, where this question was posed to him, how can we be allies? And his answer, I thought, was brilliant, was that he's not interested in allyship. He's interested in making kin, making family. And I think that was very telling for me, right? Because when we think about allyship, the question is always, well, how can we show up for each other's struggles, which is important, but that also suggests that, well, we're not already involved in it, and that it's sort of like this intermittent kind of temporary connection, right? Whereas what Estes was pointing out is that what's important instead is how do we develop networks and a structure of ongoing reciprocity. And I think that's something that I'm drawn to with relation to the notion of community that I'm building here, that it's not a temporary thing, but actually it's a mode of being. But thank you.
Thank you for that question. I love that notion of making kin, because you're right. Sometimes when we think of allyship, it's just based on incidents rather than a long-term relationship and being in community all the time. I really appreciated about what we're striving for here is changing the metrics, because a lot of the metrics is determined by whiteness and really, you know, and capitalism. And I know this is a loaded question, but how do we shift that? Because that's the way our institution is. I love the idea, and I think you're totally right. But again, it's so difficult to change those standards when the people in power want to continue to sustain it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the world to be oriented around whiteness. And our struggles are more about finding a place within the world built by whiteness rather than dismantling it. So that's one of the concerns I have. And I don't have a good answer as to how to destroy whiteness. I think that my orientation to the question, if you will, is to open up space for different modes of engaging or not engaging whiteness. I think it's absolutely important to critique whiteness, to understand its operations, and to respond. But as we all know, being in that mode all the time, it can be incredibly exhausting, incredibly tiring, and it saps us of precious time and energy to do the work and to build the worlds that we need, right? And that's another way in which whiteness wins. And so my orientation in regard to whiteness is in a couple of ways. First, I think we need to develop modes of politics that are not only about responding to whiteness, but are actively about the building of something else. And second of all, it's to recognize that what we are building is precisely what solicits violence, okay? One of the things that I tried to indicate in this talk is that one of the ways in which whiteness is allowed to have such a hold in this world is because it actively erases what I'm calling yellowness, or what I'm indexing by it. And so I think that it's important to recognize that we are already doing a lot of work that is creating space beyond a world of whiteness. Okay, we can't control how white folks are going to react. We can't control how non-white folks are going to react. But what I think we can do is do stuff for ourselves, first and foremost. And then if whiteness wants to come after us, so be it. They're going to come after us anyway. We might as well have built the kind of community to hold each other up and to provide life to each other for our struggles against whiteness when it shows up.
Thank you. And I really want to hold this space for others. I know we have some phenomenal scholars and students. Please feel free to ask any question, no question. All questions are welcome. There's a lot of theory. So feel free. Or Chad, you could go into your faculty mode and call a student or a colleague.
As the students who are here know, I don't do that. And sometimes we end up having awkward silences for up to 30 minutes in my classes.
And I'm good with silence too. We do. I really appreciate you talking about how we, as Asian Americans, sort of have succumbed to whiteness. And the quote that you brought up with Andrew Young, the comment that he made. And I think some people, and again, it's that notion like, okay, if we just work harder, then we'll be accepted. And so, what lessons, how could we impart this lesson that, as Asian Americans, how do we not succumb to that? Because I think a lot of us feel like if we just work harder, they'll accept us. But, in reality, no matter how hard we work, we're always going to be othered. We're always going to be the foreigner. And so, I don't know, this may be a question for anyone out in the audience, but I know that's something that I've heard growing up. Like, I just need to work hard and not complain. But that doesn't necessarily, um, debunk the system. And so, just a question for the audience and for you, Chad. Thank you,
Mm,
Soteri. Right now, so young, we can continue to be our true selves and not try to please others. That's so
mhm,
true.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I mean, there was a good um, piece in the New York Times recently that you can listen to as a podcast from not this past Sunday, but the Sunday previously, an article about Stephen Yun. And one of the things, and he talks about this, right, about how Asian Americans are in the mode of always having to please other people and have to put other people first. And that leaves us with no time to think about ourselves, right, and what we need and what we want and what we desire. And so I think that's part of it, right? We need to be able to sort of like look under all of the garbage that's heaped onto us by a white world to discover and to cultivate really what our desires and what our needs are. But it's really hard work, right? Because it's not as if we can simply opt out of whiteness and say, okay, well, I'm done, goodbye. That's an orientation. But I think as the work of Lauren Berlant has shown in her work on cruel optimism, we are affectively attached to all sorts of things that we think will provide our own well-being, when it's those very things that are actually harming us, right? So we think that we'll work hard and that will lead to our flourishing, when in fact, that's what's wearing us out and that's what's killing us. And so the real difficult work is about doing the kind of exercises at the level of feeling and emotions that is really political work. It's not merely personal, it's political work, and building attachments to other visions and other imaginations. And that's part of why I think it's so important that we need to start with ourselves first and then look outwards to how we might confront whiteness. Because if we never generate and never foster and never bring to clear visions the kind of alternatives that are already around us, then we'll only think that whiteness is our only path forward. And that's only going to lead to despair.
Thank you, Chad. I have a question here in the chat from Sarah Tyson. Um, your presentation was visually also really beautiful. Is that part of your theoretical practice? If so, would you talk about it a bit?
Thank you. It's part of my procrastination practice for sure. I like to think that it's part of my theoretical practice too, that the aesthetic is very important to our politics. So what I was just saying about generating alternative visions or generating clear visions for the alternatives that are all around us. That's an important political project, and I don't think I'm as good as doing the kind of artistic aesthetic work. I'm nowhere near as good, I should say, as other people. I know I mentioned Yumi Sakugawa's work, and I will mention it again. I think she's doing brilliant work to think about Asian America in terms of the kind of futures that are already here and the kind of political practice of working on affect that I've been talking about. I think what I'm trying to do with the presentation was, one of the things that I wanted to do was I was going to make all of the black screens yellow and just have us look at yellow. But then that was so disorienting to me that I thought that it would just piss people off instead of like having some sort of profound effect. So, we just ended up with this. But yes, aesthetics is important to politics and theory.
And aren't you an artist as well, Chad?
That's what other people call me, but I don't
Right.
deal with identity here.
Um, there's you're being humble. Here's another question from Quinn. Thanks, Chad, for the talk and the call out. I'm curious how you're thinking right now about yellow commons outside of an American framing and how it relates to other geopolitics, such as the simultaneity of fighting the idea of a new Cold War with China at the same time that Chinese genocide of the Uyghurs is another form of controlling the commons. Excellent point.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Quinn. Thank you. And I think that, you know, I'll be upfront. I think you're in a better position than I am to answer that. And I think Yasmin, who might be listening in, is going to be in a better position to answer that than I am, because my focus so far is, on Asian America, and I think that I'm not presently at the moment, very good at thinking about, well, the kind of Asian slash part of things. But what I will say is that. Or some things that as kind of a preliminary that your question makes me think about is what's the relationship between the yellow commons and geopolitics and a geopolitical world order, and what are the ways in which the boundaries of that world order, which has been fortified by war, which has been fortified by the spread of racial capitalism, which has been spread, which and has been a long time in the making, um, how they try to close off the yellow commons by instituting and dividing up the world in particular ways. I think that the yellow commons, in my vision of things, pops up anywhere and also destabilizes the kind of political mappings that we see. And I think that's all I can say about that now. Thank you.
And Quinn, feel free to add. It sounds like you have a lot of expertise and knowledge about that topic as well. And I know some people are having some challenges with the chat, so feel free to chime in. You can unmic yourself, or I'd be happy to unmic folks. So here's another question from Bree. Hi, Chad. Thank you so much for this talk. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the yellow commons and how and if it opens up something different than Moten and Harney's undercommons, and also how it is in common with the undercommons. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about undercommons as well for us lay people.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and thank you for that's an excellent question, Bree. Thank you. And so the notion of the undercommons comes from Fred Moten, who I talked about at the beginning of this talk, and his co-author Stefano Harney. They wrote a really important and famous piece called "The University and the Undercommons," which is part of a book called The Undercommons, which if you Google it, you can download it as a PDF for free. And they also wrote a follow-up essay last summer called The University Last Words. And what Moten and Harney's interest is in with this notion of the undercommons is thinking about a way of engaging or disengaging the university. Okay, how is it that when we're in the university, we can develop a different relationship to it that is not about professionalization, okay, and that's not about reproducing the logics of racial capital and incarceration. Okay, and with their notion of the undercommons, it's about those folks who exist as kind of refugees and criminals within the university that don't buy in to this kind of professionalizing mission. And ultimately, what Moten and Harney are seeking is what, and they draw upon the work of the geographer Ruthie Gilmore, what she calls abolition, okay? Where abolition is not the tearing down of the prison system, but it's about the positive creation of a society in which the prison system doesn't make sense, okay? Doesn't make sense. And so I think that, it's hard, part of what's hard about answering your question, Bree, is that the yellow commons is inspired by the undercommons and comes out of it. One of the distinctions that I will make is that is based on context. Okay, the undercommons comes out of the context of the university, and the yellow commons comes out of a context of yellow peril. I think that's where the distinctiveness comes in, but there are all sorts of overlaps there are all sorts of outgrowths. There are all sorts of cross pollinations and whatnot. Thank you.
Thank you. Now that's on my reading list under comments. Any other questions? I see a new comment here. Okay. What we'll do, thank you, Dr. Samora. Would you mind sharing some of the classes that you're teaching next semester in case we have some students that would be interested in taking your class? Well, thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Chad, for this really thoughtful and provoking article that you wrote and the conversation and answers. Please join us again next month. We'll have another Food for Thought. It'll be on February 17th, and it's going to be on the Pacific Islands from a professor from CU Boulder. But thank you again, and thanks. Feel free to
So yeah, and I see Stevie's asking if there's time for one more question.
Oh, yes,
or two.
of course. Stevie, please go ahead.
Sorry, I started to type this